Nelson Okeri was the kind of man neighbors liked to point at discreetly, the way people pointed at neat hedges or freshly painted gates. He dressed well, without trying too hard, greeted everyone with polite nods, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed his life was well arranged. To the outside world, he was dependable, respectable, and impressively married. People often whispered, sometimes with envy, sometimes with disbelief, that Nelson had married a woman far too composed, far too intelligent, far too complete for him. Ifeoma, his wife, walked with quiet grace, spoke with measured calm, and possessed the kind of confidence that didn't announce itself. She was the type of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard, and who didn't rush to prove a point because she trusted time to do it for her. Their home reflected this illusion of perfection. Clean lines, warm colors, tasteful furniture, nothing extravagant, but nothing careless either. Ifeoma ran a small interior design business from home, and her touch was visible in every corner. Each chair had a reason to be there. Each curtain knew its purpose. Nelson liked to joke that he lived in a showroom, though he benefited greatly from it. Guests admired the house, admired the marriage, admired the calm rhythm of a life that seemed balanced. What they did not see was how Nelson enjoyed being admired more than he enjoyed being honest, and how he mistook routine harmony for immunity against consequences. Ifeoma, on the other hand, believed in order the way some people believed in faith. She trusted systems, patterns, and consistency. She trusted her marriage not because it was flawless, but because she believed she had chosen well. Nelson never raised his voice. He never came home smelling of trouble. He never gave her obvious reasons to doubt him. And so, she built her life on trust the way one builds a house on what seems like solid ground, unaware that somewhere beneath, a small crack had already begun to stretch. The introduction of the cleaner came without ceremony, which was exactly how Nelson intended it. One Tuesday morning, while Ifeoma adjusted fabric samples on her desk, Nelson casually mentioned that someone would be coming twice a week to help with cleaning. He said it the way people mentioned buying bread on the way home, unimportant, forgettable, safe. Just someone recommended by a friend, he added, shrugging lightly. Cheap and hardworking. The words were delivered smoothly, rehearsed in tone, if not in script, and Ifeoma barely looked up when she nodded her approval. To her, a cleaner was a practical addition, nothing more. Bridget arrived the following day. She was quiet, almost impressively so. She kept her head lowered, her voice soft, her movements efficient. She dressed plainly and tied her hair back tightly, as if determined not to take up space. Nelson hovered nearby that first day, explaining things that didn't need explanation, where the cups were kept, how the floor should be wiped, which shelves required extra care. Ifeoma noticed his attentiveness, but attributed it to his usual habit of over-explaining. Nelson liked to feel useful, even when he wasn't. Bridget listened carefully, nodding, absorbing every word like a student determined not to fail an exam she already knew the answers to. As the days passed, Bridget blended into the house with unsettling ease. She cleaned thoroughly, yes, but also comfortably. She moved through rooms without hesitation, as though she had memorized the layout long before her first day. She anticipated needs that were never voiced. Tea appeared at exactly the right moment. Nelson's slippers were always placed just where his feet would land. Ifeoma appreciated the efficiency, even praising Bridget once or twice, unaware that what she mistook for diligence was something far more intimate. And Nelson, watching it all unfold, smiled to himself, not the smile of a grateful employer, but the smile of a man who believed he had successfully hidden a second life behind a mop and a bucket. It didn't happen suddenly. Discomfort rarely announces itself with a trumpet. It creeps in softly, borrowing the shape of coincidence. Bridget began to feel less like a visitor and more like a fixture, like a lamp that had always stood in the corner and was only now being noticed. She knew when Nelson would be home late and when he would arrive early. She prepared his tea exactly how he liked it, 2 teaspoons of sugar, no more, no less, even though Ifeoma had never discussed this with her. At first, Ifeoma admired the attentiveness. Then she paused. Then she stored the observation quietly away. There were moments that felt strangely choreographed. Bridget would laugh softly at Nelson's jokes, her laughter brief and controlled, as though carefully rationed. She lingered in the living room when her work there was clearly finished, wiping already clean surfaces as if reluctant to leave. When Iphioma entered a room unexpectedly, conversation stopped not abruptly, but just enough to leave behind a thin, uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that suggested something had been interrupted, not concluded. Still, Iphioma said nothing. She had learned long ago that reacting too quickly often gave people the satisfaction of thinking they were clever. Nelson, meanwhile, grew increasingly relaxed. The disguise thrilled him. There was something intoxicating about the proximity of deception, about hiding the truth in plain sight. He walked around his home with the confidence of a man who believed he was smarter than circumstances, smiling at his wife, nodding at Bridget, convinced that control was firmly in his hands. He failed to notice that while he enjoyed the game, Iphioma had begun to observe the rules, and observation, when done patiently, always outlasts arrogance. The first red flags were small, almost polite. Iphioma noticed Bridget stiffen slightly whenever she entered a room, her hands trembling just enough to be visible to someone paying attention. Yet around Nelson, Bridget was relaxed, fluid, confident. The contrast was subtle, but unmistakable. There was also the matter of scent. Cleaning products had a smell, sharp, chemical, unmistakable. The soft perfume that occasionally lingered in the air did not belong to any detergent Iphioma had ever purchased. She noted it once, then twice, then stopped counting. Then there were the glances. Quick, careful looks exchanged between Nelson and Bridget, nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to feel rehearsed. It reminded Iphioma of stage performances she had coordinated years ago, where actors communicated entire conversations with the slightest lift of an eyebrow. She didn't accuse. She didn't question. She watched. Her calm wasn't ignorance. It was discipline. She had always believed that truth revealed itself more clearly when allowed enough room to breathe. What amused her most, quietly, privately, was Nelson's growing confidence. He spoke more freely, laughed louder, moved through the house like a man certain he had mastered deception. There was something almost comedic about it, like watching someone tiptoe across a floor he didn't realize was glass. Iphioma adjusted her routine slightly, not to trap him, but to see if the pattern would shift. It did. And when patterns shift without explanation, they are no longer coincidences. They are messages waiting to be read. Iphioma had never believed in dramatic confrontations. She believed in timing. She believed in letting people reveal themselves fully, without interruption, so that when the truth finally arrived, it would arrive whole and undeniable. So she remained silent. She smiled when appropriate. She thanked Bridget for her work. She complimented Nelson absent-mindedly. To an outsider, nothing had changed. Inside, however, Iphioma's mind was quietly arranging pieces, fitting observations together with the precision of someone assembling a design she had sketched long before. Nelson mistook her calm for blindness. He had always underestimated stillness, believing movement meant intelligence and noise meant control. He did not see that Iphioma's silence was active, deliberate, and sharp. Each day he grew more careless, more assured that his secret was secure. And Bridget, sensing safety, became bolder in her comfort, less cautious in her presence, more certain that the disguise was working. The house, once a place of balance, now held an unspoken tension, thin, stretched, waiting. By the end of the week, Iphioma knew one thing for certain. Whatever truth hid behind Bridget's quiet efficiency and Nelson's polished smiles was not temporary. It was intentional. And intentional things, she believed, deserved intentional endings. She didn't yet know how it would unfold, only that it would. Because patience, when combined with clarity, had a way of turning observation into inevitability. And inevitability, once it begins to move, never asks permission. The change in the house was not loud, it was atmospheric, the way weather changes before rain without thunder announcing it. Iphioma began to feel it in the pauses between conversations, in the way Bridget suddenly found reasons to wipe the same surface twice whenever Nelson was nearby, and in the way Nelson's laughter sounded slightly forced, as though he were reassuring himself rather than entertaining anyone else. Meals continued as usual. Greetings remained polite, but something unseen had tilted. The house, once balanced, now carried a subtle lean, like a picture frame slightly crooked on the wall, easy to ignore, impossible to unsee once noticed. Bridget's behavior grew oddly precise. She timed her movements to Nelson's presence, appearing whenever he entered a room and disappearing just before Iphioma arrived. When spoken to directly, she answered politely, but her eyes betrayed her, darting quickly, never lingering. It was as though she was acting a role that required intense concentration, terrified of missing a cue. Iphioma found herself observing these moments with quiet fascination, the way one might watch a carefully constructed lie struggle under its own weight. There was something almost pitiful about the effort, though pity did not blur clarity. Nelson, however, interpreted the shift differently. To him, the silence meant success. He mistook the absence of confrontation for victory and the calm of his wife for indifference. He became looser with his movements, more confident in his steps, speaking freely in Bridget's presence, as though the walls themselves had agreed to protect him. What he didn't realize was that while he was celebrating the comfort of deception, the environment he relied on for cover had begun to record every inconsistency, storing them patiently, waiting for the moment they would be needed. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind that disguises turning points. Nelson rushed out for a quick errand, keys jingling, phone left carelessly on the dining table. Iphioma noticed it immediately, not because she was searching, but because absence creates presence. The phone buzzed once, then again, vibrating softly against the polished surface. She glanced at it the way anyone might glance at an unexpected sound, expecting nothing more than a notification from a delivery service or a group chat reminder. What appeared instead was a sentence that rearranged the room without moving a single object. The message preview was brief, careless, intimate. It spoke of missing someone, of the difficulty of pretending, of being someone else in plain sight. There was no name attached, no explanation needed. The words stood confidently on their own, like a confession that believed it would never be challenged. Iphioma read it once. Then, again. She did not scroll. She did not open the message. She did not touch the phone again. She simply exhaled, slowly, as though releasing a breath she had been holding for weeks without realizing it. What surprised her most was not the betrayal itself, but the clarity it brought. Doubt dissolved instantly, replaced by a calm so complete it felt almost gentle. There was no shaking, no racing heart, no dramatic realization. Just understanding. She smiled faintly, not with joy, but with the quiet amusement of someone who had finally received the missing piece of a puzzle she had already solved. When Nelson returned and reached for his phone, she said nothing. She watched him, and in that moment, she stopped reacting and started deciding. The days that followed were a performance, though only one person understood the script. Iphioma became lighter, warmer, almost playful. She complimented Nelson's appearance, laughed at his jokes, and spoke enthusiastically about future plans. To Nelson, this felt like confirmation that his secret remained buried. To Bridget, it felt like relief, a mistaken belief that danger had passed. To Iphioma, it was strategy. There is a particular power in calm kindness when it is intentional, and she wielded it with precision. Inside, however, she was meticulous. She reviewed financial records casually, confirming details she had once trusted without question. She revisited documents she had filed years ago, appreciating her past self's insistence on clarity and ownership. She took mental notes, not out of panic, but out of respect for process. If betrayal was careless, response would be exact. She reminded herself that truth did not need urgency. It needed accuracy. What amused her during this period was how relaxed Nelson became. He mistook her warmth for ignorance, and her generosity for surrender. He spoke freely about work, about expenses, about how lucky he was to have such a peaceful wife. The irony did not escape her. Peace, she knew, was not the absence of action. It was the result of preparation. And she was preparing carefully, quietly, without ever raising her voice or tipping her hand. If anyone had watched Iphioma closely during this time, they might have been confused by her generosity toward Bridget. She tipped her more often, praised her efficiency openly, even recommended her to a neighbor once. Bridget accepted the kindness cautiously, unsure whether to feel grateful or suspicious. Each compliment felt undeserved, like applause during a rehearsal that hadn't gone as planned. Nelson, observing from a distance, felt reassured. In his mind, generosity equaled ignorance. He did not consider that generosity could also be deliberate misdirection. Iphioma played her role flawlessly. She discussed work trips casually, mentioned deadlines, spoke of meetings that would require travel. She allowed Nelson to overhear phone calls that hinted at her absence, all delivered with relaxed confidence. She did not exaggerate or dramatize. Lies told too loudly attract attention. Hers were understated, believable, and perfectly timed. Even as she smiled, she measured reactions, noting how Nelson's posture shifted slightly at the mention of her being away. The humor of it all did not escape her. Watching Nelson plan carelessness under the assumption of safety was like watching someone rehearse arrogance in front of a mirror. Bridget, too, began to move with more ease, her fear replaced by anticipation. Neither of them realized that the stage they believed they were preparing for themselves had already been booked for a very different performance. The announcement came over dinner, spoken gently, without drama. Iphioma mentioned a short job in another city, nothing urgent, nothing long. Just enough time to handle a project and return. Nelson responded with practiced concern, asking the right questions, offering to help pack. His voice carried sympathy, but his eyes betrayed something else entirely. Relief, barely disguised. Excitement, poorly hidden. Iphioma noticed it all and said nothing. In the days leading up to her departure, the house buzzed with anticipation of change. Nelson became attentive in a way that felt rehearsed, helping more than usual, speaking kindly, as though storing goodwill in advance. Bridget's movements grew quicker, her silence charged with expectation. Iphioma moved through it all calmly, completing small tasks, aligning details, ensuring that when she left, nothing would appear unfinished. Appearances mattered. They always did. On the morning of her supposed trip, Iphioma kissed Nelson lightly, wished him a good day, and left the house with a small bag and a composed smile. She walked away without looking back, not because she was afraid to, but because she knew exactly what would follow. As her car turned the corner, the illusion of safety settled fully over Nelson's shoulders. And behind that illusion, unseen but fully present, consequence waited patiently, already on its way. Nelson watched Iphioma's car disappear around the corner and felt a ridiculous kind of freedom, the sort that makes a person forget that walls have ears and consequences have patience. He stood in the living room for a moment, hands on his waist, breathing like a man who had just completed a difficult mission, even though all he had done was lie successfully for too long. The house was quiet, but not peaceful, quiet like a courtroom before the judge enters. He poured himself water, then changed his mind and poured something sweeter, because in Nelson's mind, deceit deserved celebration. He moved from room to room with a new swagger, touching furniture as though he owned more than objects, like he owned the narrative. He even chuckled at how easily life could be managed if one simply kept people on a need-to-know basis. Somewhere in him, a voice tried to whisper that nothing built on lies stays standing for long, but Nelson treated that voice the way proud people treat warning signs. He noticed it, then pretended it was decoration. He sent a quick text to Bridget, short and confident, as if inviting her into a victory he had already claimed. The message ended with a promise. Tonight, no pretending. Nelson didn't realize that when a man stops pretending, truth starts arriving. Bridget came earlier than usual, not through the front door like a visitor, but through the side entrance like someone who believed she had earned familiarity. Her scarf was still on, her plain clothes still plain, but there was an excitement in her steps that cleaning could not explain. She moved quickly, tidying areas that were already clean, then pausing, listening, waiting for Nelson's signal the way. Nelson acted like a host trying too hard to be casual. He offered her a drink, joked about how hard work had been without Iphioma around, and laughed with the kind of laugh that asks for applause. Bridget smiled, but her smile carried nerves, because deep down she understood something Nelson refused to accept. Disguises are not shields, they are deadlines. She asked him if he was sure. Nelson waved it off with the arrogance of someone who believes certainty is the same thing as safety. "She won't be back till tomorrow," he said, as if he had personally signed a contract with time. Then he added something even worse. "This house is ours tonight." It was a careless sentence, bold, greedy, unnecessary, exactly the kind of sentence that summons consequences without even calling their name. As evening approached, Nelson behaved like a boy who had stolen mangoes and was convinced the tree would not report him. He adjusted the curtains, dimmed lights, and put on music that tried too hard to sound romantic, like a playlist built by someone who learned love from movies rather than maturity. Bridget hovered close, the way people hover near doors when they are unsure whether they are welcome. She drifted from cleaning to lingering, standing near him, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, touching her hair like it had its own instructions. Nelson enjoyed it more than he should have, because it fed his ego, and Nelson's ego was always hungry. He talked too much about how Iphioma didn't appreciate him, about how he deserved happiness, about how a man shouldn't be trapped by responsibility. His words were dressed in self-pity, but the smell underneath was selfishness. Bridget nodded, swept up by his confidence, even though confidence without character is just noise wearing perfume. Nelson didn't notice that the house itself felt different, too still, too alert, like a dog pretending to sleep while listening. He had no idea that while he was arranging his evening, the real arrangement had already been made, quietly, carefully, by the one person he assumed would never interrupt him. Iphioma did not travel anywhere meaningful, unless you counted the short journey from truth to certainty, and she had completed that trip the moment she stepped out of her car and turned the corner back toward her own house. She parked where her vehicle wouldn't announce her arrival and walked quietly, bag in hand, steps measured, breath steady. It wasn't fear that made her careful. It was precision. She had learned long ago that drama wastes energy, and energy is better saved for decisions. As she approached the gate, she saw a faint light inside, subtle proof that Nelson's lonely evening was not lonely at all. She paused near the entrance, listening. No shouting, no chaos, just the soft hum of music and the occasional burst of laughter that sounded too relaxed for a man whose wife had supposedly just left town. Iphioma's face remained calm, but her mind sharpened. She didn't feel heartbreak the way people expect it, loud, sobbing, dramatic. Her heartbreak was quiet, disciplined, and cold enough to hold a plan. She used her key slowly, turning it without the usual metallic complaint, then slipped inside as if she were entering a room she had designed for someone else. Inside, she moved like a shadow with purpose, not sneaking out of guilt, but out of strategy. She placed her bag down gently, shoes removed to keep sound from betraying her. She passed the hallway mirror and saw her own reflection, composed, almost serene, and it surprised her how normal she looked for a woman returning to meet betrayal face to face. Iphioma didn't rush toward the living room. Rushing gives away emotions, and emotions can become a gift to people who do not deserve them. Instead, she chose position. She stood near the corridor, where she could hear everything without being seen. Nelson's voice floated through the house, relaxed and proud. Bridget's laughter followed, softer, eager, uncertain. Iphioma listened, and in those minutes she collected proof without touching a phone, without recording, without begging the universe for confirmation. She simply let them speak. Lies are loud when they think they are safe. Nelson spoke as if he were justifying himself to someone, but he didn't realize he was writing his own judgment. The longer she listened, the clearer it became that Nelson did not merely slip into betrayal. He walked into it with confidence, carrying entitlement like a suitcase. He complained about Iphioma's calmness, as if calmness were a crime, described her discipline as if it were coldness, and painted himself as a victim of a life he enjoyed daily. Ifeoma almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd how quickly selfish people rewrite history when they want permission to be wicked. Bridget murmured agreement, then asked questions that revealed more than she intended. How long this had been going on, whether Nelson would truly leave his wife, whether the cleaner disguise was temporary or permanent. Ifeoma's jaw tightened slightly at that, because it was no longer just betrayal. It was boldness inside her own home. She thought about the furniture she chose, the walls she painted, the effort she invested into building peace, and how Nelson had turned it into a hiding place. Yet her anger stayed controlled, because Ifeoma understood something important. Uncontrolled rage is loud, but controlled clarity is terrifying. She adjusted her grip on the rolled-up magazine she had picked from a hallway table, not as a weapon, not as violence, but as a symbol, like a teacher ready to call a student to order. Then she stepped forward, not rushed, not shaking, just ready. The living room looked almost normal, which was the most insulting part. The couch was where it always was, the rug still perfectly aligned, the curtains hanging with Ifeoma's careful taste. Even the air smelled like home, faintly of fabric softener and the scented candle Ifeoma lit during long workdays. And there, in the middle of that familiar space, sat Nelson and Bridget as if they belonged to the same story. Bridget had loosened her scarf slightly, her posture less worker, and more woman waiting to be chosen. Nelson leaned back, too relaxed for someone who claimed he respected his marriage. His hand rested casually on the couch, and his voice carried that lazy confidence of a man enjoying a secret. Ifeoma stood at the edge of the room for a moment, allowing herself to see it clearly, fully, without denial rushing in to blur the picture. She wasn't here to guess. She wasn't here to accuse without evidence. She was here to witness. There is a difference between suspicion and certainty, and Ifeoma crossed that line without trembling. Nelson was speaking when she entered fully, and for a few seconds he didn't even notice, because arrogance narrows a person's awareness. He was busy explaining how women overthink, how Ifeoma was too serious, how a man deserved comfort without stress. Bridget giggled, as if these words were wisdom rather than warning signs. Ifeoma's presence changed the room the way a sudden cold wind changes heat, instantly, undeniably. Bridget's laughter died mid-breath. Her eyes widened, panic blooming across her face, as though her disguise suddenly evaporated under sunlight. Nelson turned slowly, and in that turn, his confidence collapsed in layers. First confusion, then shock, then the brief, desperate calculation of a man trying to find an exit from consequences. His mouth opened slightly, but no useful words came out. He looked like someone caught in the act of stealing his own future and surprised that the owner had returned. For a moment, time held its breath. Even the music continued playing like an unaware spectator, cheerful and inappropriate. Bridget's hands fluttered uncertainly, as if she wanted to cover her face, but feared touching her own shame. Nelson stood halfway, not fully standing, not fully sitting, caught between denial and reality. Ifeoma did not shout. She did not cry. She did not throw anything or break anything. Her silence was heavier than noise. She stepped closer, her face calm enough to be misunderstood as mercy, but her eyes were not merciful. They were clear. The magazine in her hand was rolled neatly, ordinary, harmless, yet it carried the weight of intention. Nelson, in that moment, realized something terrifying. Ifeoma was not reacting. She was concluding. And there is nothing more frightening than a woman who has finished thinking and started deciding. Nelson's body tensed as Ifeoma approached, as though his bones recognized judgment before his mind could fully accept it. The air between them felt thick, like a curtain drawn across the room. Bridget shifted backward on the couch, shrinking into herself, the way someone shrinks when they realize their role in a lie has no protection anymore. Nelson tried to speak, his lips moved, his throat worked, but his voice fell apart into small, useless sounds. He reached for words that could reverse time. Ifeoma, wait, and then nothing meaningful followed, because what sentence repairs betrayal caught in its own living room? Ifeoma watched him with a calm that felt almost polite, and that politeness unsettled him more than anger would have. He was prepared for shouting. He was prepared for tears. He was not prepared for quiet certainty, the kind that strips excuses naked. Then it happened. The soft, firm tap on the back of Nelson's head with a rolled-up magazine. Not violent. Not brutal. Not dramatic. Just enough to interrupt him, like punctuation placed at the end of a sentence that had gone on too long. It was almost comical in its simplicity, and that was the genius of it. A man who had staged a whole secret life was stopped by something as ordinary as paper. Bridget gasped sharply, as if expecting thunder, while Nelson froze as though the tap had knocked loose the last of his arrogance. For a second, the scene looked like a badly rehearsed play where the actors forgot their lines. The cleaner sat exposed, the husband stood speechless, and the wife held her calm like a crown. Nelson's hand went to the back of his head instinctively, more out of shock than pain, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at Iphioma as though she had broken the rules of the game by refusing to panic. Bridget's mouth opened in a silent scream before she managed a sound, and when it came, it wasn't confidence or pride, it was fear. She looked from Nelson to Iphioma, searching for rescue in the man who had promised her a future, only to realize he could barely rescue himself. Iphioma's expression did not change. She stood there, steady and composed, as if she had practiced this moment in her mind until it fit perfectly. And perhaps she had. She didn't insult them. She didn't curse. She didn't perform for the room. She simply let the truth sit where it belonged, fully visible. Nelson finally understood that the tap was not the punishment. The tap was the announcement. The real consequences were still walking in. Bridget was the first to break, because panic always reaches the weak link first. She slid off the couch and stumbled forward as if her knees had suddenly forgotten their job. Her hands trembled as she tried to speak, but her words collided with each other, apologies, excuses, tears, all tangled together. She kept saying she didn't mean it, that she thought Nelson would do the right thing, that she had been promised something that now looked foolish in the light of Iphioma's calm stare. Nelson, meanwhile, tried to gather authority like a man trying to scoop water with his bare hands. He lifted his palms, as if to slow time. Iphioma, listen, he began, the universal opening line of guilty people everywhere. He tried to sound reasonable, as though betrayal could be negotiated into something small. He tried to talk over the truth, to shape it, to shrink it, to soften it. But the truth didn't shrink. It just sat there, heavy and undeniable, refusing to be managed. Iphioma raised a hand, not aggressively, not theatrically, just enough to stop him. The gesture was quiet, but it silenced the room. Then she spoke, finally, her voice soft but firm, like a verdict delivered without shouting. Stop. Nelson's mouth closed. Bridget sniffed loudly, wiping tears with the back of her hand. Iphioma looked at Bridget first, not with hatred, but with clarity that felt worse than hatred. You were never cleaner, she said, slowly, letting each word land. You were a secret. Bridget flinched. Iphioma continued, steady as stone, and secrets never stay hidden. Then she turned to Nelson, and her eyes held him the way a mirror holds a face, honest, unavoidable. And you, she said, turned my trust into your hiding place. Nelson swallowed hard. In that moment, he didn't look like the admired man of the estate. He looked like a boy caught stealing from someone who loved him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of shame, full of collapse, full of endings. Nelson's mind raced, searching for an escape route. Anger, apology, distraction, blame, anything that could shift focus away from his guilt. But Iphioma's calm left no room for performance. Bridget, still kneeling, realized she was not the heroine in a love story. She was a footnote in someone else's downfall. Nelson's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his own arrogance pressing down. And then Iphioma delivered the line that sealed it, gentle but cutting, the kind of sentence that echoes long after a door closes. So this is the cleaning service you hired. Bridget's sob caught in her throat. Nelson's eyes darted around the room, as if the furniture might defend him. But the room belonged to Iphioma, every curtain, every wall, every careful choice. And now, even the moment belonged to her too. Nelson tried to regain control the way a man tries to straighten a tie while his shirt is on fire, busy, desperate, and completely missing the bigger problem. He took a step forward, palms lifted, voice lowered into a reasonable tone that guilty people reserve for moments when their lies are finally forced into daylight. "Ifioma, please," he began again, then switched quickly to explanation, as if explanation could act like soap and scrub away betrayal. He claimed Bridget had only come to clean. He claimed they were just talking. He claimed loneliness, stress, temptation, confusion, every word a small stone tossed into a river, hoping it would change the direction of the current. Bridget, still shaken, nodded furiously at whatever sounded helpful, then contradicted him with her crying. She said he promised her more. She said he said Ifioma was cold. She said he said the house felt like a showroom and he needed warmth. Nelson winced at each sentence, not because he regretted saying them, but because he regretted them being heard. The more Bridget spoke, the more Nelson's story cracked open like overripe fruit. And Ifioma stood there calm, watching the unraveling like a seamstress who had finally found a loose thread and was now pulling gently until the whole false garment came apart. Bridget's apology became a flood. She swore she didn't mean to disrespect Ifioma. She insisted she fell in love, that Nelson made her feel chosen, that she only agreed to the cleaner role because she thought it was temporary. There was something almost tragically funny about it, the idea that a woman could be reduced to a disguise and still think it was romance. Yet the humor was bitter, because the cost of such foolish hope was always paid by someone else. Bridget begged for forgiveness in a voice that cracked and wobbled, and Nelson watched her with irritation, like a man angry that his accomplice was no longer cooperating. Ifioma noticed that too. She noticed how Nelson's eyes weren't full of remorse. They were full of calculation. She noticed how he didn't reach for her, didn't ask if she was hurt, didn't apologize first. He only tried to manage the damage. And in those details, Ifioma found the final proof she needed. This was not just a mistake. It was a habit dressed up as an accident. When Nelson realized Ifioma wasn't shouting, he tried a new tactic, softness. He spoke of their history, their vows, the good times, as though memories were currency he could spend to buy silence. He even attempted humor, offering a nervous laugh that died quickly when it met Ifioma's stare. "Let's not make it bigger than it is," he said, and the sentence landed like an insult in a clean room. Ifioma tilted her head slightly, the way one tilts a head when hearing something unbelievable, not because it's shocking, but because it's ridiculous. The betrayal had happened in her own home, and he wanted it to be small. Bridget kept crying, Nelson kept talking, and the room filled with noise. Then Ifioma spoke again, quiet enough to cut through everything. "You both keep talking like I'm here to negotiate." Her voice wasn't cruel. It was final. Nelson's words stopped mid-air. Bridget's sobs softened into confusion. And in that pause, the truth finished unraveling. They were not facing a woman desperate to be chosen. They were facing a woman who had chosen herself. Ifioma moved to the armchair opposite them, not because she needed to sit, but because sitting made the scene feel less like a fight and more like a meeting. And Ifioma preferred meetings. She crossed one leg over the other with calm elegance, as if she had simply walked in to discuss home renovations and discovered a mess she didn't hire. There was something deeply unsettling about her composure. Nelson expected rage. He got quiet authority. Bridget expected insults. She received measured words. And measured words, when delivered without shaking, feel like doors closing one by one. Ifioma looked at Bridget first, and spoke with clarity that left no room for drama. "Stand up," she said, not harshly but firmly. Bridget hesitated, then rose slowly, wiping her face. Ifioma continued, "You can cry, but crying won't change what you did. You entered a home you didn't respect." Bridget opened her mouth to argue, but Ifioma raised her hand again. "Don't," she said, and the single word felt like a lock clicking shut. Then Ifioma turned to Nelson, and the air grew colder, not because she was cruel, but because she was honest. "You didn't just betray me," she said. "You used me. You used my trust as cover. You used my peace as a hiding place." Nelson's face tightened. He attempted to interrupt, but Iphioma's gaze stopped him. She spoke again, slowly, like someone explaining something to a child who keeps insisting fire isn't hot. You brought your secret into the one place that should have been safe. That's not love. That's arrogance. Nelson swallowed hard, eyes darting, searching for a softer interpretation, but Iphioma offered none. She wasn't here to comfort him. She was here to draw a boundary so clear it would embarrass anyone who tried to cross it again. What followed was not a shouting match, but a dismantling. Iphioma stated facts. Bridget's work arrangement ended that night. Nelson would not raise his voice in her house. No more explanations, no more pleading, no more performances. She spoke like someone reading rules that had always existed, but were only now being enforced. Nelson tried guilt, mentioning sacrifices, finances, stress. Iphioma didn't argue. She simply replied, "You don't get to blame pressure for choosing dishonor." Even Bridget, in her shame, seemed to realize Nelson had sold her a fantasy that collapsed quickly. She looked at him, and for a brief second, resentment flashed in her eyes, because when a lie fails, even the accomplice feels cheated. Nelson noticed it too, and flinched, as if Betrayal had turned around and faced him. Iphioma watched that moment with quiet irony. Betrayal always has a strange way of eating its own tail. The night ended without screaming, but it didn't end without endings. Bridget left first, slipping out with her scarf pulled tight again, not as disguise this time, but as shame. Nelson followed behind her to the doorway, as if escorting her might preserve his dignity. But dignity doesn't survive betrayal. It simply relocates to the person who refused to beg. Iphioma locked the door after they were gone and stood alone in the quiet living room, listening to the silence settle back into the house like dust after commotion. She didn't cry immediately. She cleaned up small things, straightened a cushion, turned off the music, opened a window to let the night air sweep away the smell of borrowed perfume and borrowed courage. There was something almost humorous in how normal her movements were, like a woman tidying after guests who overstayed. Yet beneath that normalcy was a deeper calm, the certainty that she had reached the final page of a chapter she did not intend to reread. The next morning, Nelson returned with the cautious posture of a man approaching a sleeping lion. He expected coldness, maybe threats, maybe a dramatic scene. Instead, he found Iphioma at the dining table, composed, already dressed, as though she had a full day planned that did not include his panic. She placed an envelope on the table in front of him with gentle precision, the way one places a plate down, quietly, firmly, without asking permission. Nelson stared at it as though it might bite. "What is this?" he asked, voice hoarse. Iphioma replied, "Open it." He hesitated, then tore it open with clumsy fingers. Inside were divorce papers, neatly arranged. But there was also something else, documents that confirmed what Nelson had always assumed but never verified: ownership. Nelson's eyes moved across the papers, and the color drained from his face. The house, hers. The car, hers. The business he bragged about at parties. The life he wore like a designer suit, built on her structure, secured under her name. Nelson's mouth opened, then closed. He looked up at Iphioma, shocked, like a man realizing he had been playing chess while his opponent was calmly holding the board. You planned this," he whispered. Iphioma didn't smile proudly. She didn't gloat. She simply said, "I planned my life well. You just never ask questions." The line was soft, almost polite, yet it hit harder than shouting. Nelson finally understood. He hadn't lost because she was cruel. He had lost because she was careful. Nelson tried to bargain, because when pride collapses, it often reaches for negotiation like a drowning man reaches for floating wood. He asked for time. He asked for secrecy. He asked for forgiveness in a voice that sounded more terrified than sincere. "Think about what people will say," he pleaded, as if public opinion could repair private betrayal. Iphioma listened, not because she was moved, but because she was thorough. Then she responded with calm that felt like steel wrapped in velvet. "People can say what they want," she said. "They weren't here when you turned my home into a hiding place." Nelson tried to shift blame toward Bridget, calling her a mistake, a temptation, a woman who threw herself at him. Ifeoma's eyes narrowed slightly. Don't insult me with that, she replied. You chose. Say the truth, you chose. Nelson fell silent again because the truth, when spoken plainly, leaves no room for performance. Packing happened slowly, not because Nelson had many things, but because humiliation slows people down. He moved from room to room collecting clothes, shoes, small items, each object suddenly heavy with meaning. It's a strange thing to watch someone pack their life when they assumed they would always live comfortably in it. Nelson's hands trembled sometimes, not with sadness, but with the fear of the unknown. He tried to keep his phone hidden, tried to step outside to make calls quietly, as if he could still control how much of the story escaped. But even his secrecy looked foolish now, like a man using an umbrella indoors after the roof has already collapsed. Ifeoma watched from a distance, not hovering, not taunting. She simply observed him moving through spaces he would no longer claim, the way one watches someone return borrowed items, without conversation. By late afternoon, Nelson stood at the door with 2 bags, his shoulders slumped. The estate that once praised him now felt like a stage where the spotlight might switch on at any moment. He looked at Ifeoma one last time, searching for mercy he did not earn. What do I do now? He asked, voice small. Ifeoma's response was quiet but honest. You do what adults do, she said. You face what you caused. Nelson swallowed, then attempted one final line, almost comical in its desperation. Can I at least come back later after you calm down? Ifeoma raised an eyebrow slightly, the smallest gesture, but it carried a laugh she didn't need to voice. Nelson, she said gently, I am calm. That's why you're leaving. Then she opened the door wider, not forcefully, simply making space for the consequence to walk out. Nelson stepped outside, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a final sentence. The house felt different after he left, not empty, but lighter, like a room after someone stops smoking inside it. Ifeoma stood by the window for a moment, watching the driveway, not with longing, but with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had removed a splinter she didn't realize had been poisoning her peace. She did not celebrate loudly. She did not call neighbors. She did not post anything. Her victory was private because her dignity was private. She walked through the living room and noticed small things she had overlooked. How the couch looked more like hers again. How the curtains hung with their old confidence. How the silence now felt restful rather than suspicious. Ifeoma brewed tea and drank it slowly, not because tea could heal betrayal, but because routine is a form of self-respect. She reminded herself that she was not starting over. She was continuing, just without the weight of someone who thought love was a place to hide wrongdoing. In the following days, she redesigned more than furniture. She changed locks, yes, but she also changed habits. She stopped explaining herself unnecessarily. She stopped shrinking her needs to make space for a man's ego. She rearranged the living room slightly, not because it needed new beauty, but because she wanted her environment to reflect the new truth. Friends called, sensing something. Ifeoma answered politely and briefly, like someone who had nothing to prove. Nelson's name floated through the estate like gossip does, careless, hungry, eager. Some people pitied him. Some blamed her. Ifeoma let them. People always need a story that makes them comfortable, even if it's inaccurate. She did not spend her energy correcting comfort. Instead, she focused on building peace so strong that it wouldn't need anyone's approval. And whenever someone finally asked, softly, carefully, how she knew, how she stayed so calm, how she didn't explode, Ifeoma gave the same gentle answer, a sentence that sounded simple, but carried a lifetime of wisdom. People think disguises hide intentions, she said with a faint smile. But character always shows through. Then she would add, sometimes with a touch of humor that made the listeners blink. Besides, if someone is truly a cleaner, you'll know. Because they clean. They don't rearrange your husband. It was the only joke she allowed herself, light enough to breathe, sharp enough to teach. And in that new order, quiet, dignified, self-owned, life continued. Not perfectly, not pain-free, but truthful. And for Ifeoma, truth was the only luxury that mattered. Please like and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.